Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for waiting. Welcome to the last in our series of the Politicians and the Professionals 2016. And again, we are very delighted to have the support of our five professional organisations, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, ICAS, the Accountants, the Law Society of Scotland, the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, and the Faculty of Advocates. Also delighted to have the participation of the Young Academy of Scotland, and at the end of the formal proceedings this evening, I'll ask Nasa Mia just to tell us a little bit about the work of the Young Academy. The First Minister has spoken on these occasions this is her third time, and we are very grateful to see her here today. It's been a busy day. I'm exhausted, and I've been watching it on television. It started with the Deputy First Minister appearing before the Devolution Further Powers Committee this morning to say there was no deal on the fiscal framework. And he's quite adamant about that. And then the First Minister made a statement to the Parliament this afternoon to say, well, there was no deal on the fiscal framework, but she just had a note from the Treasury saying there might be a new offer on the table, and she would just think about that and talk about that. And then there was a late statement at 5:30, which is what was delayed her coming today, to say she'd actually had a call from George Osborne. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, only the First Minister can judge, because none of the rest of us have had that privilege. But nevertheless, there is now a settlement on the fiscal framework. So a very busy day for the First Minister. We're very grateful for her for coming to speak to this evening. I'm also grateful to Athol Duncan of ICAS for chairing the question and answer later. And I will now hand over to the First Minister.
Thank you very much indeed, Ray. What can I say? Taking calls from George Osborne so that none of you have to. The sacrifices I have to make as First Minister. Anyway, it's a real pleasure to be here again. I think this is about the third time I've delivered one of these lectures, so it's a real privilege to be here again. The David Hume Institute has been at the forefront of public debate in Scotland for more than 30 years. So it's right that you continue to provide a forum like this. And there's no doubt that these Meet the Leaders sessions have become an important part of that, and are fast becoming actually, a very established part of our public debate and discourse. I highly value, as I'm sure all the other party leaders do, the opportunity to discuss with you some of the big issues facing our country for the future. In my opening remarks tonight, I want to focus on a hugely and very topical issue under the theme of transforming Scotland, and that, of course, is how the Scottish Parliament should use its new powers in the years ahead. As part of that, I'm going to talk about future plans for social security, council tax and income tax. And at the end of my speech, I did intend to set out for you the latest position on the fiscal framework negotiations, which, of course, is absolutely essential to successful delivery of our new powers. And I had planned to tell you that there was no deal and set out to you why there was no deal, but things have moved on, and moved on very positively in the last little while. In fact, the reason I'm late tonight is because in the last couple of hours we have got to a position of being able to reach agreement in principle that will allow us to recommend approval of the Scotland Bill to the Scottish Parliament. But I'll come back to that at the end, and perhaps update you on the basis on which we've felt able to make that recommendation. But fundamentally tonight, much of my speech is going to tackle a much broader question. And it is a question, I think, that is of and should be of concern to progressive politicians and policymakers the world over. How do we balance world-class public services and strong social protections with also having the right incentives for enterprise, wealth creation and sustainable growth? In essence, what does social democracy mean in practice? And I want to start with a very basic point, which is that taxation policy, like economic policy more generally, is really a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. Ultimately, it's one of the means by which, through the collective contribution that we all make as individuals, the governments help people to live happy, healthy, and fulfilling lives. It's therefore impossible, really, to separate a debate on the tax and welfare system we want to establish from a vision of the society that we want to create. And one of the themes that was central to the referendum debate, and of course I am now talking about the Scottish referendum debate that lies behind us, not the European referendum debate that lies ahead of us, but one of the themes that was central to that, and indeed to politics in Scotland subsequently, has been the desire, indeed I would put it more strongly than that, the yearning of many people to live in a fairer society as well as a more prosperous one. And that desire, I think it's important to say, is not confined to one party, just as it wasn't confined to just one side during the referendum. It was widespread and deeply felt, and I think it continues to be so. And that's one reason why last year, the Scottish Government, when we revised our economic strategy, we placed the pursuit of fairness and competitiveness on an equal footing. Something that is quite pioneering in terms of the approach that is taken internationally. One, fairness and competitiveness, one of these does not, should not take priority over the other. They are two sides of the same coin. And there's now very strong international evidence to back up that view. 2 years ago, the OECD estimated that between 1999 and 2010, inequality in the UK reduced the UK's economic growth by 9 percentage points. Now, that sounds very abstract and largely meaningless, but if you translate that into money, that translates to £1,500 for every person, the price of inequality. So that's why Scotland is, in many respects, leading the way when it comes to inclusive growth, because if we have a fairer society, we'll have a more prosperous one, just as the same is true vice versa. And it became obvious to me just how much Scotland was leading the way when I discussed this approach last year with the World Bank and the IMF. We know that we need a strong business sector to create skilled job opportunities and to generate the revenues that good public services depend on. That's why the Scottish Government and our enterprise agencies support thousands of companies every year to innovate, to export and to expand. Just last week, for example, we launched a new manufacturing action plan setting out concrete proposals to boost a sector that is responsible for half of our exports and more than half of our R&D investment. And it's part of our ambition to make Scotland the best place in the UK to do business. So we need a strong economy, that should go without saying. But we also know that a strong, a growing and a sustainable economy also depends on creating a more equal society where everyone can participate to their full potential. Workers who are well educated, well trained, well paid, highly valued and supported will be more productive than those who are not. And of course, they'll also be happier, healthier and enjoy a better quality of life. Indeed, it's the desire to realise such long-term economic dividends, at least in part, that lies behind some of the Scottish Government's most important social investments. For example, we've worked hard over the last few years to expand childcare, and we've now promised to almost double the level of free childcare available for 3- and 4-year-olds and more vulnerable 2-year-olds, from 600 hours a year now to more than 1,100 a year by the end of the next Parliament. We intend to ensure that that care is delivered flexibly because that's required to meet the needs of parents, but also to ensure that it's of a high quality because that's required to meet the needs of children. And the expansion of childcare, I think, can be and should be a defining legacy of the next term of the Scottish Parliament, an investment which helps parents into work, gives children the best possible start in life, and in so doing, both of these things helps to make Scotland a wealthier and a fairer country. And our plans for childcare also support our ambitions for raising attainment in schools. We've published a national improvement framework and directed additional resources to schools in areas of greatest disadvantage where those resources are needed most. And I've made clear my personal determination to narrow and then to close the gap in attainment between children in the most affluent parts of our country and those in the least affluent areas. So education and childcare, perhaps above all else, are the building blocks of a fairer society. Our investments here are essential to delivering true equality of opportunity and driving future economic success. But in recent years, we've also placed very deliberately a growing emphasis on fair work. We've brought government, trade unions and businesses together to encourage progressive workplace practices and to improve productivity. As part of that, we've provided strong encouragement for payment of the living wage. Back in 2014, when I became First Minister, there were only 34 living wage accredited employers in the whole country. Now there are more than 470, and we have a higher proportion of workers paid the living wage than any other UK nation. We've also published new procurement guidance, which explicitly recognises fair work, including payment of the living wage, as a vitally important consideration when we're taking decisions about awarding public contracts and using public money in that way. And that overall approach is perhaps best encapsulated by our Scottish Business Pledge. More than 200 companies have now signed up to that pledge, and it celebrates companies that are committed to employee engagement, gender equality, payment of the living wage, companies that are also ambitious about internationalisation and innovation. And it's intended to send a powerful message of what it is I'm talking about, that progressive business practices are something to be celebrated, not simply because they're good in themselves, though they are, but also because they contribute enormously to long-term commercial success. For businesses, good business practices represent enlightened self-interest. And for government, it's an important part of our drive to create a high-wage, high-productivity society, one where everybody has that chance to contribute to economic success and everybody receives a fair reward for it. So it's that principle of inclusive growth that defines our economic strategy. And so it follows from that as the Scottish Parliament does assume new fiscal powers over the next couple of years, our approach to the use of these powers should also be consistent with that approach. We will, in deciding how to use those powers, recognise, as we do already in our economic strategy, the interdependence of greater equality and higher growth, and seek to strike a balance between encouraging enterprise and promoting fairness. And we will, notwithstanding the limitations on these tax powers, seek to establish a modern tax system based on enduring Scottish principles. David Hume's great friend, Adam Smith, of course, set out 4 guidelines for taxes, which I think still hold very true today. He said that taxes should be certain, convenient, administratively efficient, and proportionate to the ability to pay. And those principles underpin the Scottish Government's approach and will continue to do so. There are 2 additional points that are worth emphasising here. The first is that tax avoidance undermines all of Adam Smith's principles. It also corrodes public trust, not just in business, but in government and in society more widely. That's why we are determined to tackle it, and it's why we've already passed legislation enabling Revenue Scotland, which is the new body we set up to administer some of our new tax powers, to take action against tax arrangements which are artificial. And that's a broader test than the test applied in the UK, which is a need to prove abuse. And it demonstrates a determination to ensure that the burden of tax is shared fairly and that people and companies pay the tax that Parliament intends them to pay, which I think is a really important principle in securing the trust of the wider population in the tax system we have in place. And the second point is that when it comes to developing tax policies, we're committed to a collaborative approach to consult regularly with taxpayers, industry, academics and professional bodies. One of the failings, I think, of UK tax policy is the way in which tax changes are managed, especially the nature of budget day rituals. Too often tax and benefit changes get announced in order to produce rabbits out of a hat in a budget statement, or to wrong foot the opposition and surprise the media, rather than as a result of consultation and engagement and well thought out proposals. A good example of that is the increase in supplementary charges for the oil and gas industry in 2011, which proved to be very damaging, or the unravelling of the Chancellor's proposed cuts to tax credits earlier this year. It's not always possible, of course, to announce all tax changes in advance, but in general, consultation and predictability are virtues rather than vices, and I think they should, wherever possible, be at the heart of Scotland's approach to taxation, because that makes it more likely that changes will work and less likely that decisions have to be reversed when they prove to be unworkable. I'll show how those principles apply to future policies in a second, but it's maybe worth just looking briefly, firstly, at the decisions about taxation that the Scottish Government has already taken. One of our earliest steps on taking office in 2007 was to lower business rates, answering widespread calls from the business community, and introduce the small business bonus. That bonus currently helps around 100,000 business premises across the country, from corner shops to high-tech startups. And it's one really important way of giving a helping hand to the smaller companies, which are such an important engine of our economic growth. We've also announced an intention for the future to reduce air passenger duty in the next Parliament, and that is to deal with the fact that the UK is the most expensive, got the most expensive tax of its kind in Europe. And for Scotland in particular, as a country at the periphery of Europe, it has a big impact on business competitiveness. So the reduction we propose is a sensible way of addressing a specific problem to help businesses boost tourism and support wider growth. We're also increasing the rate of landfill tax in this year's budget. It's a measure that will raise revenue in the short term, of course, but it will also encourage, in future, an even greater shift towards the recycling and reuse of materials. So that's a good example of tax policy that is not an end in itself, but a means to a social, economic, or in this case, environmental end. So where we can, we've already demonstrated that we will use the tax system to boost businesses. And as part of that, we also want to ensure that the tax system as a whole is progressive, that it addresses rather than cements the inequality that harms our economy, and that it promotes growth and social inclusion. The land and buildings transaction tax, which is, I'm sure, not the one that is of greatest interest to most people across the country, of course, unless you're buying a house. But that tax was the Scottish Parliament's first new tax power in more than 300 years. And how we've used that is a good example of the principles that I'm talking about. The stamp duty system we inherited was flawed. People often walked off a cliff. They would pay no stamp duty in properties up to £124,000 to then having to pay the entire stamp duty on property worth £125,000. And that distorted the property market. It led to clusters of properties being valued at prices just below the thresholds. So we consulted about how we could make that system better, and we've made the land and buildings tax simpler and more progressive than stamp duty. It ensures now that people buying properties worth less than £330,000, that's 93% of all house buyers, pay no tax or less tax than would have been the case under stamp duty. We've also introduced this year a 3% supplement for purchases of second homes, which is a step that is deliberately designed to help first-time buyers, people buying their first house on the market. So that is an example of the way in which, so far, the Scottish Government has opted to use its tax powers. And that should give a guide to how we will seek to use new powers in the future. And let me now look to the future, because in the coming weeks, we will publish proposals on 3 specific areas: on social security, where the Scottish Parliament is gaining new powers; on council tax, where we have existing powers; and on income tax, where we are gaining new powers. If you take social security first, when we've been able to do so, we've adopted a different approach to welfare from the UK by retaining key social protections. So, for example, when the UK government abolished educational maintenance allowance, we maintained and then expanded those, and they're currently helping more than 50,000 young people from poor backgrounds stay on in education, something that is vitally important to what I was talking about earlier on, using education as the bedrock of a fairer society. Through the Scotland Bill, we'll gain responsibility for disability and caring benefits. We'll gain some flexibilities around the implementation of universal credit in Scotland and control over certain other benefits, including funeral payments, which I'm sure nobody wants to think about specifically this evening, and Sure Start maternity grants, as well as cold weather and winter fuel payments. And we've already begun to set out how we will use these additional powers. At the end of last year, we announced that our new social security powers will be founded on a set of principles that have at their heart a commitment to treat people with dignity and respect. Because we believe, and here I think we differ from the UK government, we believe that social security is an investment in the people of Scotland. So we want to replace, for example, the work allowance, which in its current form is failing to help people into work. And we also want to use the new flexibilities within universal credit to give people more choice in how they manage their money. We currently spend about £100 million a year mitigating some of the worst effects of UK government welfare policies. Amongst other things, this ensures that nobody faces eviction as a result of the bedroom tax, and we will use the new powers when we have them to abolish the bedroom tax completely. So respect for the dignity of individuals is at the heart of everything we will do. We intend to improve the benefit system for disabled people with long-term health conditions and for carers. For example, we've already set out an intention to increase the carers allowance so that it matches the level of unemployment benefit. Next week, the Scottish Parliament will debate social security, and we'll set out some further thinking on the day of that debate. But all of the proposals we bring forward will be informed by widespread consultation with people and groups across the country. And I hope they will demonstrate our determination to develop a social security system which is an investment in the people of Scotland and which helps with the aims I've been talking about to tackle poverty, promote fairness, value individual dignity, support people into work where they can work, all of which, of course, adds up to our aim of a more competitive, prosperous economy and fairer society. We'll also intend in the next Parliament, and we'll set out details of this next week, to make changes to the system of local taxation. For the last 9 years, the council tax freeze has safeguarded household incomes during what have been very difficult economic times. The Scottish Government has funded local authorities to deliver that freeze, so it's a policy that has helped individuals while maintaining public services. But the report of the Cross-Party Commission on Local Tax Reform made clear that now is the time to reform local taxation. The Commission argued for measures which would make council tax more progressive and which would give greater assistance to people on low incomes. So next week we'll set out details of how we intend to achieve this from April 2017 onwards. And I think it's important to say to you tonight that these changes will be part of a longer-term plan to increase the accountability of local councils to the populations they serve. In particular, we're going to discuss with local authorities how we, as the Scottish Parliament gains more power over income tax, how we then assign to local authorities a share of income tax revenues for their area. And the reason for doing that is quite straightforward. It means that if councils succeed in boosting economic growth locally and consequently they boost income tax receipts, they will share in some of that benefit. So they are incentivised to boost economic growth. And it also means that local government funding, which many people think is too narrowly focused, will become much more broadly based. And that approach will go a long way towards meeting an important concern of the Commission that income and property-based taxes together would be a better source of revenue than council tax alone. And that's a further example, I think, of how considering expert evidence can help us to propose a better tax system. And finally, before the election, we will also publish proposals relating to income tax. The income tax powers that the Scottish Parliament was granted under the initial devolution settlement and then under the 2012 Scotland Act are very, very inflexible. The reason for that is that any increase or reduction in one tax band automatically has to apply to all of the tax bands. So any increased rate affects higher earners, but it would also inflict an additional tax burden on anyone earning more than £11,000. That's why the Scottish Government has chosen to keep income tax levels unchanged in the current budget. It's probably a recognition of the fact that these powers are a blunt instrument that led the Labour Party, when proposing a 1 pence increase in all of the tax bands, to also propose a rebate for those who earn less than £20,000. However, that rebate is a plan whose legal basis and practicality are still very unclear. Of course, the inflexibility of the current powers is also why Lord Smith recommended further devolution of income tax policy. As a result of his report, which of course was agreed by all parties, we expect the Scottish Government in future to be able to adjust tax rates for specific bands and also to change the thresholds at which people start paying different rates of tax. So over the next few weeks, we'll set out in detail how we would propose to use these powers to create a fairer income tax system for Scotland. But let me stress, like all of our proposals on council tax and on any other tax rate, we will set out not just the changes we make, but also the effect this will have in public services, and also make sure that we are striking that balance between fairness and economic growth, competitiveness and prosperity. Because that's one of the great things about gaining additional powers is the ability to establish a much clearer link between the taxes people pay and the public services we all use. So if any Scottish Government takes decisions which raise additional revenues, we have a duty to explain why we're doing that and how the additional revenues will be spent. Similarly, any party that proposes to cut taxes will have to explain how these cuts are paid for. And that greater transparency and accountability, making the Scottish Parliament much more responsible for the money we spend, will be good for democratic debate, and ultimately it should be good for decision making. And as we debate taxation, social security and public services, we will continue to make an important argument not just for high quality services, but for universal services and benefits in many key areas. We're sometimes criticised as a government for making prescriptions free or for making university tuition available to all rather than subjecting these policies to means testing. But I don't believe that people in low incomes should feel stigmatised simply for accepting entitlements, one of the difficulties with means testing. And I also believe that people on higher incomes should benefit from some of the key services that they, after all, are helping to fund. So I think universalism is fundamental to our wider vision of society. We don't and shouldn't see society as divided between those who contribute to public services and those who benefit from them. I think that everyone who contributes to society, and we all do at different times and in different ways, is entitled to benefit from certain key benefits. Now, as promised before I finished, I'll say a word or two about the fiscal framework, because of course all of what I've been talking about today, income tax and social security, it has been predicated on reaching agreement on a fiscal framework. Basically what we've been trying to agree is the principles that were set out in the Smith Commission. It said that there should be a fiscal framework to accompany new powers that was based on, amongst other things, the principle of no detriment. And what that means in relation to devolving income tax is that if, as the Scottish Government takes responsibility for income tax, we change the rates of income tax up or down, or if we, through the decisions we make, fail to match the economic growth rate of the rest of the UK, then our budget should bear the consequences, or indeed the rewards, of that. But if we don't change the rates of income tax, if they remain absolutely the same as the rest of the UK, and if we match UK economic performance entirely, then there should be no detriment whatsoever to the Scottish budget initially or in the years ahead. That's the principle of no detriment that I think most people agreed that we were signing up to in the Smith Commission. We've been having a tough round of negotiations with the Treasury, where I think it's fair to say the Treasury took a different view of no detriment than we did. Treasuries do what treasuries do, and if I can be impolite about it, that is try to grab as much cash in any negotiation as possible. And what the Treasury was seeking to do was reach an agreement that would see the Scottish budget bear detriment in the years ahead, flowing from the fact that our population, as it has done for 300 years, is projected to grow at a slower rate than the population in the rest of the UK. Now, that's due to deep-seated and long-standing differences between fertility rates, death rates, and, of course, it's driven heavily by migration policy. So they wanted to drive a population-driven detriment through our budget that, based on what they were proposing, could have cost our budget £7 billion over the next 10 years, or, based on a modified proposal, that would have gone down to £3 billion or £2.5 billion, notwithstanding the fact that the Smith Commission doesn't give us any additional powers to influence and drive population growth. So that's where we were this morning. But thankfully, we've managed to reach agreement, and what I've just announced to the Scottish Parliament is that we've reached an agreement that delivers no detriment to the Scottish budget. That will be done firstly through a transitional period of 6 years where the block grant adjustment will be done in a way that guarantees the no detriment that our preferred model would have delivered, which was per capita index deduction, that probably nobody apart from Anton Muscatelli in this room understands. But that no detriment is guaranteed. We will then review the system, but there will not be the ability then to impose any no detriment outcome on the Scottish Government, because we will have to agree any system to replace that at the end of the transitional period. So, as I said to John Swinney, who's done most of these negotiations, he is perhaps the only person that has ever seen off the attempts of the Treasury to steal £7 billion out of his budget, and he's done it very well and very successfully. So that's where we are with the fiscal framework, and I'm glad we're here because it does allow us to move into the kind of debate I've been talking about tonight. How do we use the powers, albeit powers with limitations, to continue and build on our work to make Scotland a better place to live? That's what I look forward to debating in the weeks running up to the Scottish Parliament elections, and subject to the views of the Scottish people, it's what I hope to keep delivering as First Minister in the months and years after the Scottish election. But thank you very much for listening to my thoughts this evening, and I'm of course happy to answer any questions you've got or listen to any observations. Thank you very much indeed.
So thank you very much for that, First Minister. Certainly there's plenty to talk about, and as Ray was saying, this is your third time in front of this audience, so I think you know the format. We'll have about half an hour of Q&A from the audience. We prefer questions. We do take statements, particularly if they're insightful, but we prefer questions. So if you could say...
if they're insightful or not.
If you can say who you are, and I appreciate a lot of you are just representing yourself, but if you're representing an organisation, if you can state what that organisation is. And I'll take the first gentleman in the middle of the room here. I think someone will find you with a microphone, and then if people can just indicate if they want to speak, we can have you stacked up. Sir, on you go with your question.
Nicola Sturgeon, actuary with Buck Consultants. Thanks for your talk, Nicola. It's insightful. There's been a lot of changes made in recent budgets at a UK level to pensions, particularly private pension provision. And rumours are abound at the forthcoming March budget that changes will be made to tax relief on particularly contributions going into pensions. Be interested to hear your thoughts on sort of how some of these changes perhaps are kicking some longer term problems for lack of pension saving into later.
First Minister?
You want to,
Yeah, if you answer that one.
I've heard the same rumours you have. Unfortunately, I have no hard and fast insight as to the extent to which these rumours are true or what the changes might be that we will hear in the March budget. If you get any information on any aspect of the March budget, I would be absolutely delighted to hear it. I think this is one area where, it is more important perhaps than in any other area that governments do what I was suggesting in my speech. Be careful and consultative and very deliberative and think through carefully the changes that are made, because particularly around pensions, changes that can be made in the short term can have profound and lasting implications for the longer term. And when we face the demographic curve that we face as a country with an ageing population, a good thing, it's more important than ever that we get pensions policy right. Some of the changes that have been made recently to allow people to access their pension pots earlier, lots of reasons why that's a good thing, but it does present dangers in terms of leaving people without pension provision, and there are many people, of course, who don't have pension provision, but leaving even more without pension provision. And I would be concerned if further changes disincentivised pension saving in any further way. The other thing, just on pensions, I know it wasn't your question, I think what is currently being done to women of a certain age in terms of their pension, state pension entitlement, I think is scandalous and wrong, and I think the government should seriously think again on that.
Okay, David, if others can just pop their hands up, we'll try and find this gentleman at the back, but we'll take David's question first.
David Lonsdale, Scottish Retail Consortium. First Minister, you mentioned local taxation and specifically the conclusions of the Commission on Local Tax Reform. And I think you also mentioned about increasing the accountability of councils as well. The Commission recommended councils should be allowed to have power over local sales taxes and also tourism taxes. And I was wondering to what extent, if any, either of those forms part of your own thinking in your statement next week.
We'll set out in more detail next week what we're going to do. Our priorities will be on changes to the current system and also around the assignation of income tax that I spoke about. We will consider carefully other tax powers for local authorities, but again, we've got to be, I think, thoughtful and deliberative about that. Scotland is a small country, and I think it's right that we take steps to incentivise local authorities to boost growth in their areas, but equally we've got to be careful about creating a postcode lottery in terms of tax rates in different local authority areas. So without going into the precise detail of what we're going to announce, we're very thoughtful about some of the issues that you're talking about.
Okay, lady at the back. Gentleman at the back, sorry.
My name's Thomas Ward. First Minister, if you cast your mind forward to, say, 2020, and let's assume that Britain decides to stay in the European Union. Let's assume that you remain First Minister of Scotland. And let's assume that George Osborne, as Prime Minister of Britain, is looking forward to annihilating the Labour Party.
You have to spoil that thought process.
But to come on to the serious question, how far would you envisage that it's realistic for Scotland then by 2020 to have a system of taxation which is significantly different, sufficiently different from that of the rest of the UK to have made all the moves for independence and devolution worthwhile, but without it being undermined by the beginnings of people just voting with their feet?
Well, you may think asking me to think ahead to 2020 is a big ask, but I've spent most of the day thinking about what happens in 2022 when we get to the review of the fiscal framework. So my mind is in that space already, and I'm not sure whether George Osborne is a better or worse prospect as Prime Minister at that stage than Boris Johnson. So, I'll probably just let that drift in the ether. But thank you for the putting forward the proposition that I will remain First Minister. I'll grab that as a positive. I think we've got to be... I'd say two things in relation to your question. Firstly, I think while I'm excited about the opportunity to use new powers creatively, we've got to be level-headed about the constraints of the powers that we're getting. We're effectively getting power over one tax, which is income tax, which is not insignificant, but it doesn't allow you to make the variety and the diversity of balanced judgments that governments that have all taxes under their purview are able to make. So let's not get carried away about it. I would like to see a Scottish Parliament that was much, much more empowered than the one that is going to be there as a result of the Scotland Bill. But secondly, and this is a really important point, and because I hope to be First Minister in the timescale you talk about, I've got to think very carefully about this, because tax policy and the exercise of tax policy has to have an eye not just on the immediate revenues you might raise from it, but any behavioural change or unintended consequences that flow from it. Because it's the revenues you raise from a tax rate that are important rather than the rate. You know, it's not the symbolism of the rate you set that's important, it's the revenues you raise from that. So if, and I'm not talking here about any specific potential policy, but anything we did that meant, and there are some tax changes you could do that would on paper raise your revenue, but in reality cost you money if you encourage people to leave and go elsewhere, would be a self-defeating thing for any government to do. So what I would say to you is we will be very thoughtful in balancing all of these things when we make any decisions on the use of tax powers. They've got to fulfil all of the different things I've been talking about, contribute towards a fairer society, but also a stronger economy, because you can't have one of those without having the other. So that's the holistic way in which we have to approach any decisions that we would take around tax.
Gentleman right at the back. And please, anyone else, just put their hands up and we can find you with a microphone. And that saves a bit of time so we get more questions in. Sir.
Jamie Livingston from Oxfam, Scotland. First Minister, as you know, we very much welcome your focus domestically on inequality, because we know what a barrier it is both here in Scotland and globally to challenging poverty, and we look forward to all parties building on that ambition with measurable policy commitments ahead of May. Will you also agree with me, though, given your commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals, given the global humanitarian system is creaking at the seams at the moment, that we also need to deepen and protect our international contribution? And if that's the case, do you agree that we need to restore the value of the International Development Fund that's been frozen for 6 years and maintain it throughout the next Parliament? And to underpin that in the longer term, make sure that we commit to building on the Scottish Government's welcome commitment to global citizenship education in Scotland by deepening and extending the commitment to the development education centres, funding for which is running out shortly. Thank you.
Well, the latter point is one that I haven't forgotten you raised with me previously, so thank you for that gentle reminder. General answer to your question, yes, I do think it's important. I believe this passionately, that as well as dealing with poverty and inequality at home, notwithstanding the financial challenges we face as a relatively rich country, we have a moral obligation to contribute to tackling poverty and inequality overseas. In terms of our international aid budget, you know, we've protected that budget throughout the last Parliament in cash terms, and that's not been easy to do in a situation where we've had such a downward pressure on our overall budget. I certainly would like to think that we could protect it in real terms over the life of the next Parliament, but you know, obviously we've yet to publish our manifesto and make particular commitments there, but that's an aspiration I don't think you would find me disagreeing with. In terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, we were, I think, one of, if not the first country to signal our support for and sign up to the Sustainable Development Goals, and I'm keen, a bit like our Human Rights Action Plan, to increasingly mainstream that through the decision-making process. We've got see John Elvidge here, former Permanent Secretary of the Scottish Government, who's very familiar with our performance framework as the Scottish Government, and to increasingly align the development goals and the Human Rights Action Plan with that framework is something we're seeking to do. So yes, I do agree with the general thrust of your questions, and I've taken another note about your schools point, and I promise you I haven't forgotten.
Okay, well done. There's a lady here, and if you could nip right round the back, there's a gentleman at the far back left.
Thank you, Elizabeth Meehan. I wanted to ask you about Brexit, because as you know only too well, the usual argument is about whether demographic differences in the voting patterns would trigger a second referendum on independence. But there's also another interesting point which was raised last week in this very room by Drew Scott. That is, supposing the whole of the United Kingdom, including Scotland, voted to leave the European Union, under the reserved powers model that the devolution settlement has, a lot of issues, agriculture, fisheries, aspects of justice and home affairs, which they are the power devolved to the Scottish Parliament, and in the absence of an EU framework, they would then become presumably the exclusive powers of the Scottish Parliament. And I wondered whether the Scottish Government or the SNP had thought about the possibility, or that possibility, in the event of the result of the EU referendum.
Of course, yes. I'm in favour of staying in the European Union, and I'm very passionate in that view. Of course, if there was a decision to come out and Scotland, as part of the UK, was out of the European Union, yes, there would be, although quite how this would work and over what timescale, the extraction of the UK, I don't think it's clear how that would happen. But let's assume ultimately that it happens. Then yes, I mean, fishing, agriculture, there would be a change in where responsibility or influence in some of these issues lay. I think on the other side of that, we'd be taking ourselves out of the single market of hundreds of millions of people, 500 million people. We'd be, giving up on some of the important social and human rights protections that come with Europe. We'd be turning our back on the free movement of people, which benefits not just people who come here, but all of us if we want to travel elsewhere in Europe. So I think taking all of that into account, I think it's better that we stay in the European Union, not because I think it's a perfect institution, it is not, but I think our interests are better served by being within. People often say to me, how can you have that view? You support independence for Scotland, but you want to remain a member of the European Union. And I would simply point out to that every member state of the European Union is an independent country. So by definition, there's no conflict between independence and membership of the European Union. Independent countries simply share some of their sovereignty in that way. You asked me about the prospect of another independence referendum should Scotland be taken out. And let me just be really frank about this. I've said, and it's a view I hold, that if we find that Scotland votes to stay in, but the rest of the UK votes to come out, and we're outnumbered, and we find ourselves at the exit door, would people in Scotland say, hold on a minute, maybe we should look again at being independent to stay in the European Union? I think inevitably people would. I've spoken to many people who voted no in the referendum who would possibly change their view. And partly that's because of how central the issue of Europe was in the referendum. The No campaign said, vote yes and you'll get chucked out of Europe. It wasn't true, but nevertheless, if we find ourselves at risk of being taken out now, I think that will have that effect. But I don't want that to happen. Yes, I do want Scotland to be independent, but that's not the circumstances in which I would choose to have another independence referendum, partly because I don't think it would be the ideal circumstances for a referendum, but also I don't want to see the rest of the UK coming out of the European Union. I think it would be damaging for the rest of the UK, and contrary to what some people might think, and notwithstanding my support for independence, I do actually care about the rest of the UK. So this scenario that keeps getting put to me, and I give an honest answer on, is not actually a scenario that I'm conniving in any way, kind of Machiavellian way, to bring about. I hope that scenario doesn't arise and Scotland becomes independent for other reasons in the years to come.
And while we're on Brexit, what's your reaction, your thoughts about seeing David Cameron and Boris Johnson facing off over the last 48 hours?
Incredibly entertaining, but that's probably not. I think the Tory party, and I think we've seen this in the last couple of days, are going to descend into complete and utter civil war over this. I think David Cameron has tried very hard to manage it in a way that will avoid that, but I think we've seen in the last 48 hours that he's going to struggle to hold his party together. And what I'm about to say, you might think I take pleasure in because they're opposition to me parties, but I'm not sure it's good for democracy. You've got a Labour Party right now that is divided to the point of being dysfunctional, and you may be about to have a Tory party that is divided to the point of being dysfunctional. Until such times as the SNP can govern the whole of the UK, that's probably not... Just for the avoidance of any doubt, I wasn't being serious there, okay? Nobody tweet that out as an actual proposition that I've made. But, I don't think that's necessarily good for democracy, but it's, I think, the inevitable consequence of the road that David Cameron started down a couple of years ago when he said there would be the referendum.
Gentleman at the back.
Yeah,
there's a microphone there. Yeah.
Donald McRae, trustee of the David Hume Institute. Can I take you back to your comments about future economic policy? You quoted, and you're often quoted for your comments on reducing inequality, and also tonight you've stressed the importance of making the Scottish economy a bit more competitive and increasing productivity and so on. Don't you see any conflict at all between these?
Well, I would hope from what I've said is that I do recognise the tension that often exists between them. And I'm not saying it's easy to balance that tension, but what I'm saying is I think that's the challenge that governments have to try to live up to. And one thing I do believe is that too often in the past, we focused on the tensions between them rather than on the mutually supporting relationship that also exists. So, I've grown up, and all of us have, but I'm a politician, in an era where you were either a politician that was pro-business and therefore deemed to be right-wing, or a politician that is pro-social justice and equality and therefore deemed to be left-wing. I think we've got to get away from seeing those two things as opposing objectives. And that's not to deny the tensions that will always exist, but our challenge is to try to bring them into a position where we're exercising policy to accentuate the mutual support that one gives the other. That's what we've done right through our economic strategy, and it's what we'll do through our approach to taxation policy as we get new powers. Will that always be easy? Will we always be able to get that balance absolutely right? Probably not. But if we start with the intention of doing it, as opposed to starting by seeing these things as irreconcilable polar opposites, then I think we'll have a better chance of getting the decisions right.
So the next question is just here. And anyone else, please pop your hands up.
Anne Packard. First Minister, thank you for your talk. At Beyond Borders last autumn, I raised with you the question of a concern about standards of literacy and numeracy. You've referred quite correctly to the need to provide childcare and the importance of the early years. Could I ask you what 5 steps you will take, one in each of the next 5 years, to ensure that there are truly significant transformational improvements in the standards of literacy and numeracy?
Okay, I'm not going to do it sequentially like that, because it's not going to be we'll do one thing one year and one thing another year. But the steps we're taking right now are around the attainment challenge and attainment fund that we have established, which is directing resources, and these resources are targeted specifically at literacy, numeracy and well-being in schools, and they're targeted at schools in our most deprived areas to try to deal with the particular challenges around literacy and numeracy in children who live in some of these areas. We're also making sure that as we do that, we're not because you could close the attainment gap by bringing down the standards at the top rather than, so we're concentrating through campaigns like Read, Write, Count on raising the standards generally, as well as trying to close the attainment gap. The National Improvement Framework that I've spoken about will mean that over the next few years we will start through a more standardised approach to assessing children in schools on things like literacy and numeracy, that we'll be able to have a much, much clearer view of what the performance is, not just at local authority level, but down to school level, and therefore we'll be able to measure how improvements are being made, or if improvements are being made. When I became First Minister, and not having done a government job in education before, I became very quickly very kind of taken aback by the fact that if you're looking at school performance in upper secondary, you've got exam results, you're awash with exam results that allow you to tell how schools and pupils are performing. But in primary schools and lower secondary school, there is virtually no information there that allows us to tell that and know for sure. So the National Improvement Framework will address that. And also, I'm going back the way now, what we're doing in early years, improving not just the quantity of early years, but the quality, which is partly down to making sure we've got qualified teacher or childcare graduates in early years settings to make sure that from the very, very early stage, there's that focus on literacy and numeracy, as well as broader well-being issues. One of the other things is about making sure that as children move in from early years to school, the learning and the information about how they're doing and if they're dealing with any, or if they're facing any challenges, that goes with them. Because often when a child goes from nursery to school, it's like it's starting all over again in terms of finding out how that child is doing. So there's a whole wealth of stuff that we're doing just now that's not going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 over the next years. We're doing it as part of a coordinated, comprehensive way of making sure we're raising levels, we're closing the gap, and we are able to say, I want to be able to stand up within a reasonable period of time and say Scottish education wasn't just once world class, it is world class now, and everything we're doing is about giving us the ability to be sure of that, and I think that's worth striving for.
Gentleman just in here.
First Minister, Paul Thompson, the Rector of Jordan Hill School in Glasgow. So can I first of all welcome your remarks about education, which you've just made. You said earlier that education and childcare above all else are the building blocks of a fair society, and you've just elucidated in that for us. Perhaps the clearest manifestation of that is what I understand to be your commitment that teacher numbers in state schools will be maintained in the coming year. Is it in fact your expectation that people who run state schools like me will maintain teacher numbers? And harking back to your earlier remarks about the revised financial framework for local authorities in the future, do you foresee that that commitment will be sustained beyond the coming year?
Yes, I do. I should say the final stage of the Scottish Government's budget for next year takes place in the Scottish Parliament tomorrow. So, much of what we're talking about in this context will be finalised in the course of that tomorrow. But yes, I do. We've deliberately, for the last couple of years, included in our budgets and in the budget agreements we reach with local authorities the commitment to maintaining teacher numbers. And I think that's important, not because it's the only thing that matters in education, but I think the contribution of good quality teachers to excellence and equity in education is absolutely essential. So, we're putting forward a budget now for next year. We'll set out budgets for later years later, but we are committed to and will continue to be committed to making sure that we maintain teacher numbers.
Okay, there's another question here.
Hi, thank you. Bill Roger, European Movement in Scotland. Your theme has been balancing fairness with opportunity, and I was also struck by your use of the word investment in terms of social security. It seems to me that possibly the place where that all comes together most sharply is in the area of refugees and asylum seekers, and of course commendably you've taken more than Scotland's share of people who find themselves in that terrible situation. Do you have any systematic plans to extend that, to transform their personal misfortunes into an opportunity for them in their new country, and ideally for the community as a whole, or is it purely being done on a patch basis? It is one of the few areas where you can influence the population of Scotland, the size of the population of Scotland.
Well, I think there's two issues in that, and I'm not entirely sure which one you're getting at, but I'll briefly talk about both. One is the quantity, the number of people that we're able to accept for refuge here in Scotland. And in that, we are restricted by the global number of refugees that the UK government agrees to take. Now, they've agreed to take, through the Syrian Vulnerable Persons Relocation Scheme, 20,000 over the life of this UK Parliament. Now, that's still at small numbers, and of the small numbers that have come so far as part of that 20,000, a higher than population share have come to Scotland. I would like to see, and I've argued this case with the UK government, that they should extend that commitment and agree to take more than 20,000. The refugee crisis is not going to go away. If countries just bury their head in the sand and say, we don't want to take refugees, it's not as if they disappear. The way in which they end up coming to countries will just be more chaotic and therefore cause more difficulties. So far better for countries across Europe to come together in a meaningful way and try to deal with it in a coordinated way. And I think that's what I think should happen. And I think as part of that, the UK should up its agreed contribution. That's not, I think, likely to happen in the immediate sense, but we'll continue to argue for that. Then there's the question of what happens when refugees come here. And, my strong view is our obligation starts when they arrive here. It doesn't end when they arrive here. So we've got a huge amount of work goes into welcoming, settling, integrating and supporting refugees that will continue for many years after they first arrive. And I think, to be fair, Scotland is recognised, and Glasgow in particular within Scotland is recognised at having some of the best arrangements anywhere in place to support refugees. I met a couple of weeks ago a family that recently came through the scheme from Syria. They had family, parents and 3 young daughters. Their son had been murdered in a sectarian attack before they left Syria. They'd gone to Jordan, been in a camp in Jordan for a period, and were now here. Now, they're grateful to be here, they're settling well, but the psychological trauma that particularly their daughters are experiencing is significant and quite acute. So that is just one of many examples of why the support has to be in place. So we're working really hard on this, both in terms of the obligation to take a decent number as part of our model obligation, but making sure that we give the right support when refugees are actually here.
First Minister, can I ask you about what you were saying about local taxes? And I appreciate you said that there was a consultative approach that you were taking to it, but are we on a long road to replacing the council tax with local income tax?
Well, if you don't mind, I won't answer that right now, because we're going to set that out next week, and I'll get into all sorts of trouble
I thought I could
if
still smell a story.
Once a journalist, always a journalist. We'll set out our plans next week.
Angus Grosser, encouraged by your recent 15-round contest with the Treasury, will you adopt a flexible and imaginative approach to borrowing powers, particularly in relation to infrastructure?
So speaks the Chair of the Scottish Futures Trust. Yes, we will. Without going into details, the heads of agreement of the fiscal framework will be published within the next couple of days, and we'll see. But we have, I think, managed to achieve a good deal on both capital and resource borrowing powers. And the capital borrowing powers, without giving all the numbers around it, will allow us flexibility in terms of investment in infrastructure. So we'll be working closely with the SFT to make sure we make maximum use of that in the years ahead.
Other questions? Sorry, gentleman here. And we're kind of getting into injury time now, so if anyone does have a burning question, please pop your hands up. We'll take this one first.
Hopefully a super sub in the injury time, Athol. Back to education, First Minister, if that's okay. Neil McLennan from the Young Academy of Scotland. We've done a lot of work with the Cabinet Minister on education. Can I ask, the focus on education and the focus on improving education is very welcome just now, but how will we maintain that high standard during a time when we have geographic staffing shortages and then we have particular STEM staffing shortages? And at the same time, how will we guard against the potential for more pressure to reduce the standard of entry for teachers into the profession and maintain the high standard of degree level qualifications?
Well, it's a good question. It's one I was discussing just a couple of weeks ago with the General Teaching Council, because I'm keen that we do facilitate, not just for reasons of supply, but also for reasons of getting the best people into our schools, that we facilitate different and innovative routes into teaching. But of course, we've got to be absolutely sure we're getting the right standards and the right quality. So General Teaching Council has been working on some of this, and that will continue to inform their way ahead. STEM in particular is a challenge. I don't think we're alone as a country in facing challenges in getting people into STEM subjects, particularly girls and women into STEM subjects, not just into teaching STEM subjects, but into working in these areas generally. So again, through Skills Development Scotland, through our interaction with businesses, we're doing a whole range of different work to try to encourage from as early as primary school, even earlier than that where we can, young people to think about these careers as positive options. And I think we're seeing some success there, but we've still got a significant way to go.
I don't think there's any more questions.
I'm sure there is, if you want
Ray,
to.
Ray's going to propose a vote of thanks, but First Minister, on behalf of everyone in the audience and myself, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, First Minister, for your usual articulate and comprehensive speech and answer to the questions, and to Athol for facilitating the question and answer so well. Before we close, this is the last of the Politicians and Professionals series that we've had this year. But we are going straight on to our spring series, which is not overtly political, but does have some links with some of the things the First Minister was talking about, particularly inequality. Our next seminar is on the 14th of March with the Carnegie UK Trust, looking at affordable credit. How do we provide for low-income families and individuals the access to credit at reasonable rates of interest? So not alternatives to Wonga, if you like, and the Carnegie Trust has been working on that for a year, and we'll be very interested to hear their conclusions. And then in early April, we'll hear from Naomi Eisenstadt, who's been the First Minister's independent advisor on inequality and poverty over the last year. She will, at that stage, not be working for the Scottish Government because her term of office will come to an end with the Parliament, but she will be able to give us some insights into the things that she has learned during that period. I did say, just before we wrap up, that I would give Nasser Mir from the Young Academy of Scotland a couple of minutes, 2 minutes, to talk about the work of the Young Academy, but I know that some of that is very dear to our hearts and I'm sure to the First Minister. And then after that, we will be delighted to continue the conversation before you, but I'll hand over to Nasser.
Great. Well, thank you, Rain. Thank you, First Minister. Good evening, everybody. I appreciate I stand between you and the wine reception outside, and that's always a very precarious place to be, so I shan't take very long at all. It's just an opportunity to say a few words about the activities of the Young Academy of Scotland, who are a co-sponsor of this lecture series, and of course based here in the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Those of you who have been coming to these talks will already know something, I think, of our mission and of our aims and objectives, and so I won't repeat that here, but I'll just say that we represent young leaders in different disciplines and indeed in different sectors that work collaboratively in seeking to inform public policy and support Scottish society through our respective research and practical expertise. We see these activities across a range of our working groups, some of those you will be familiar with, Research the Headlines, Computing in Schools, our industry group, our group on open data. But I'd just like to highlight another couple of activities that perhaps haven't been mentioned before. The first is led by colleagues Eileen Fife, Ineke de Motel and Sharon Ashbrook and focuses on women in academia. It's an initiative that goes beyond the Women in Science project, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and it looks at all women in the Young Academy of Society from whatever discipline. It's an initiative that tries to track the career paths of female academic members by demonstrating the varied routes they've taken to success, varied in terms of discipline, varied in terms of personal circumstance, varied in terms of opportunities. And I think it's very much designed to be an inspiration for female early career researchers, many of whom perhaps still harbour doubts about whether academia is a career for them. The second activity is our working group on silent histories, led by our Arts and Humanities group, which seeks to inform the public debate by recognising the stories of migrants and refugees, and the recognition that these stories need to be made more audible and visible if Scotland is to grasp a proper kind of sense of itself. So we're using first-person narratives of Irish fleeing the famine, kinder transport, evacuees escaping the Holocaust, people fleeing the civil war in Somalia, and of course the voices of Syrian refugees. And we're creating a short film and a schools pack, which we hope will help inform young people and also adults in Scotland that migration into Scotland isn't a novelty in its various forms. And whilst we've got very good at kind of tracking population dynamics and measures of where populations reside and so forth, I suppose our hope is that if we're ever going to respond properly to the issue on the challenge of migration and refugee arrival and integration, perhaps we need to understand not only the society where we're going, but also as a country where we've come from. Perhaps I can end by congratulating another one of our groups you may be familiar with, Computing in Schools. They run the first LEGO League, which is effectively a school robotics tournament, and who saw and guided the Scottish team West Linton Wasps from West Linton Primary School to be crowned UK and Ireland champions yesterday. This team will now go to compete in St. Louis in the US, and where they'll meet President Barack Obama. So well done to them, well done to the people in YAS who supported them. Do please follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, consult our web pages. We're always very keen to meet people and talk about collaborative opportunities. Thank you very much. Thank you.